Today, we're here to talk about the valuable ideas inside the book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, which was written and published in 1989 by Stephen Covey. Joe, as the premise of our show, you have read this book and I have not. So can you please give me and our listeners an overview?
Yeah, sure, Jeff. So this is probably the classic self-help book of our time, at the very least. I think Think and Grow Rich would be the classic self-help book. 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. On its cover, I'm sure it's probably sold millions more since this edition came out, but this says 25th anniversary edition, over 25 million copies sold. How many of those 25 million do you think read it?
Yeah, right.
So 25 million copies sold. I mean, this is just absolute perennial great advice. And the funny thing about this 25th anniversary edition is, like, the first 10 pages or so are testimonials from famous people. Like, it's just page after page after page after page of writers and marketers and business people and any realm you could ever imagine, just talking about how wonderful this book is. And this book is about how to be effective. And we're going to talk about what effective means a bit during this show. It's important to determine the difference between effectiveness and efficiency. Mm-hmm. You know, it's not the 7 habits of highly efficient people. It's being effective. It's getting shit done, mm-hmm. right? And what sort of shit are you getting done? Mm-hmm. That's really the idea behind the book. And he lays it out with 7 habits, and we'll talk about what he means habit. You know, what a habit means to him, and we'll talk about, you know, how they all kind of interrelate to one another, all of the habits, and how he kind of draws a roadmap and then kind of a larger idea. So it's not just, you know, these 7 habits in order and they're totally disconnected. It's also not linear. It's not just, you know, you do 1 and then you do 2 and then, you know, 7's after 6. They all kind of work together. They're all kind of connected to one another, and they're all focused around how do I get shit done?
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool.
So I'll lay out the habits first. I think that's probably a good place to start.
Yeah.
And then we can dive in. So the 7 habits of highly effective people are: be proactive. Begin with, that's number 1, be proactive. Number 2 is begin with the end in mind. Mm-hmm. Number 3 is put first things first. Number 4 is think win-win. Number 5 is seek first to understand, then be understood. Number 6 is synergize. And number 7 is sharpen the saw.
Okay.
And so he doesn't jump right into the habits. The first thing that he talks about is the concept of paradigms.
Okay.
Are you familiar with the concept of paradigms?
I'm not, no.
So the short definition is really another word that you could use for it would be perspective, the way that you see something. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And he talks about making a paradigm shift. He talks about kind of the difference between approaching a problem the same way that you always have. And mm-hmm. you know, if you have a paradigm shift, what has happened is you've got this impassable issue that you've been working on for quite a while. This is an example of a paradigm, this isn't the definition, but mm-hmm. you've got this problem, impassable issue that you've been working on for months or years or decades, whatever it is, and something happens. You get a new piece of information, or something changes within that problem. Any million number of things happen to make you see that problem in a different light. Mm-hmm. So you're seeing it from a perspective that you've never seen it before. And that new perspective allows you to then attack that problem in a totally different way. It's like, I've just been banging my head against this wall, trying to solve this with, you know, volume. I've just been trying to do as much as I can to get this problem solved for years. And then all of a sudden I realized, well, I just wasn't doing the right thing. And I never once thought to take a step back and say, well, is it the thing that I'm doing that's wrong? I always assumed it was the number of things that I was doing. I'm doing the right thing, I'm just not doing enough of it. A paradigm shift would be to say, no, you're not doing the right thing. And it doesn't matter how many times you do that wrong thing. It's only when you do the right thing that's going to solve your problem for you. Mm-hmm. And So he illustrates this in the, it's kind of an introduction. He calls it, inside out, and he's talking about paradigms. But I'll quote from the book. The way we see the problem is the problem. People are intrigued when they see good things happening in the lives of individuals, families, and organizations that are based on solid principles. They admire such personal strength and maturity, such family unity and teamwork, and their immediate request is very revealing of their basic paradigm. How do you do it? What are the techniques? What they're really saying is, give me some quick fix advice or solution that will relieve the pain in my own situation. They will find people who will meet their wants and teach those things, and for a short time, skills and techniques may appear to work. They may eliminate some of the cosmetic or acute problems, but the underlying chronic condition remains, and eventually new acute symptoms will appear. The more people are into quick fix and focus on the acute problems and pain, the more that very approach contributes to the underlying chronic condition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, I think it comes down to the perception and in viewing things that way. And it reminds me of a book that I really enjoy and really think is one of the best books I've ever read is Obstacles Away by Ryan Holiday. And he talks about the Stoic principles. And one of the famous quotes by Marcus Aurelius, one of the ancient Stoics, is it ends with what stands in the way becomes the way. And it's by taking a problem and viewing it differently is actually the way that you should go about things, because sometimes it's not just giving up and just going on to something else because there's going to be another problem over there. It's taking a problem and trying to solve it and looking at it differently and objectively is like one of the first principles of making the obstacle becoming the way. And that's in that book. And I really enjoy that book. And that's a very similar concept that they talk about. So.
Well, you and I talked about this. I don't know if it's even published. I think it was the first time we recorded episode 1. That's, somewhere in the archives of my computer. Mm-hmm. The difference between the self-help literature, like maybe even earlier than this, like pre-20th century for sure, maybe even pre-19th century, and the self-help literature that we get now. And I believe we talked about this thing where, like back in Thomas Jefferson's day, the self-help literature that you got, and this is directly related to this book, the self-help literature that you got was about becoming a more virtuous person. It was about improving yourself, improving your own being, and being a more, a happier and, more family oriented, whatever you consider to be virtuous, telling the truth, all of these things that are intrinsic to yourself. And then there was a shift. Again, it's hard to pin down, but it's certainly before Think and Grow Rich was written, because I would put Think and Grow Rich in the second category of writing self-help books about things that you can do. Mm-hmm. It's Tony Robbins, right? It's all not to say that there's anything wrong with Tony Robbins. I like Tony Robbins, but it's very tactical. It's very, here are some things that you can do in order to impress upon your circumstances, in order to maybe make a change in the things that you're experiencing. And Tony Robbins talks plenty about virtue and changing yourself first. But like, you look back at really, really old literature about how to improve your circumstances, and it says, well, just fix yourself. And then you look at newer, The Secret, we've maligned on this podcast before, but this idea, the law of attraction, where if I put a thought board together and I really concentrate on, that's a trick. You're trying to engage in a technique in order to improve your circumstances. And the paradigm shift that he's talking about is the difference between looking at somebody who's got a great family life and saying, oh my God, what do you guys do to stay that, together and grounded? And it looks like you guys all have all this fun. What, do you guys do something every Sunday night that brings you? They're looking for the tricks, the techniques, versus the answer probably being, well, we all strive to live really sound, moral, virtuous lives and to love one another as much as we can and share our caring. It's really just the paradigm shift is the difference between what are you guys doing and how are you living? Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah. So that's how he starts the book, is like this, yes, we're going to talk about habits, but these are not tips and tricks. It's not the 7 tips and tricks of highly effective people. It's the 7 things about highly effective people that make them what they are. Mm-hmm. And in there, it's something about repeated actions over time. Sure?
Yep.
Okay. So he goes from there to talk about what is a habit. He calls a habit and this is, maybe something we'll agree with or disagree, but for his terms, if we're going to come to his terms, a habit is the intersection of knowledge, skill, and desire. So you know what to do and how to do it. You're pretty good at it, and you want to do it. And when all three of those meet up, that's his definition of a habit. That's, you know how to do it, you're able to do it, and you want to do it, so it's probably going to happen.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if I would argue that. I would have to think about it.
Sure, and it's probably different than the definition that like Charles Duhigg, who wrote The Power of Habit, would give you, right? And hopefully we'll talk about that book sometime in the next weeks or months. But that's how he defines habit. And then the other thing that he talks about before he gets into the habits is a very, very important concept in the book, which is he defines it as the PC principle. Not PRINCIPAL, not like the South Park character, the PC principle, but the PC principle, which is he defines it as the difference between P and PC, and P is production, and PC is production capability. And he argues towards the beginning of this book, before he jumps into any of the habits, that most people waste their time trying to improve their production. You spin your wheels and you work your ass off, and it's volume. You're trying to solve the problem by volume, right? I'm not doing enough of this thing. And, the PC principle, the production capability principle, says you will make far, far, far more improvement. You will be far more effective if you work on your production capability than if you just work on your production. I'm building a widget, and I spend 10 years figuring out, and this is where we can kind of get into efficiency versus effectiveness. This is really the idea here. Think of production as efficiency, and production capability is effectiveness. And I can spend 10 years in a factory making widgets by hand, or to some extent by hand. I'm assembling the last 5 steps by hand. And I get really super duper efficient. I work on my production. I make sure that my hands are moving as quickly as I can. There's no wasted energy. All the parts are in the right place from the beginning to the end. And then, every process is dialed in as much as it possibly can be. And I started out making 20 widgets a day. And, by the end of it, I'm making 300 widgets a day. That's working on my production. And I spent 10 years doing that. And, after a few years, you can kind of, there's some tweaks that you can make, but you're kind of on autopilot at a certain point. That's working on production. That's being more efficient. It's not necessarily being more effective. It isn't being more effective because you're making 300 instead of 20. But working on your production capability would be to do that job for however long, it's 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever it is. And at a certain point, you want to say, okay, I'm going to hit a ceiling. It doesn't matter how efficient I am at this. The most widgets that I could possibly make over the course of a day is 325. And at the end of that day, I feel like I'm going to die. What if I invent a machine that handles a lot of these? What if I increase my capacity to produce these widgets? And instead of assembling these last 5 steps by hand, I only have to do the last step by hand. So I'm going to invent a machine that does steps 1 through 4 for me. Takes me 2 years to invent that machine. And then after that 2-year period, I'm now creating 2,000 widgets a day instead of 300. That's effective. That's being effective. You can be efficient if there's a pile of bricks over there and I tell you to move that pile of bricks to the other side of the room. You can be terribly efficient at that. You can figure out the best way to get those bricks across the room. It's not effective if there's no purpose for it, right? If I just tell you to move the bricks around the room, there's no effectiveness in it, but you can still be very, very efficient. So that's the PC principle.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think about that one, like with exercising. I always get in arguments with people about how much they work out and what they do. And what I find when I go to the gym a lot is I always see, and I even have this guy who I work out with in the mornings, who I see every morning, and he does he comes in for 30 minutes. He just kind of does a bunch of exercises and then he leaves. And people ask me for advice and opinion. I tell them, hey, you need to do, if you're going to do it, even if you're going to just work out for 20 minutes, do the same workout for 20 minutes, do it for like 3 or 4 weeks and get stronger. So get actually more effective at your strength. And they don't want to do that. They just want to come in and do different exercise and not. So after a year or two or years of working out, you're literally just maintaining doing the same things. You're not really doing anything. So you have to actually come in. If you're going to work out and be effective, you actually have to follow some sort of process and habit, or you're not actually doing anything. You're literally coming in and you can feel good about yourself, but you're actually not doing anything. So you're better off doing a shorter workout, doing the same exercise, trying to increase your strength, versus coming in and just doing a bunch of different random exercises that have no impact on your body whatsoever.
Yes. Yeah.
And I can get in that argument with so many people, and they, every single time, majority of people will say that they won't want to argue it and they won't want to do it, and it's fine, but I'm just telling you, you're not doing anything.
Yeah.
You're effectively doing nothing.
It's not effective. You're doing something. I mean, far be it for me to criticize you for like getting up at 5:30 and getting
well, it's
your
like
ass
moving
out
the
of bed.
bricks. Like you move the bricks to the other side of the office, but there's a more effective way to move the bricks. There's a more effective way to work out. And if that's what you're trying to do, like if your goal is are you just doing it because you're just doing it, or are you actually doing it because you want to lose weight or get better? Like that's my point. I think that's what I feel like I hear from that is like, are you just doing it to just do it? Like, am I coming to work every day to just do my job, or am I coming to work today to actually work towards something?
To produce for the organization.
Yeah,
to figure
exactly.
out, okay, here's, instead of making 200 calls, what if I make the best 75 calls that I can make, and in doing so, end up reaching out in a much different way than I would have. That's the paradigm shift, right? As like, instead of trying to bust out 200 calls regardless of who I'm calling or what time I'm calling them, I'm going to focus on 100 calls, and I'm going to make them between the hours. This is a Tim Ferriss thing. We talked about this with the 4-hour work week. Is like, I'm going to make my calls between 7:30 and 9:30, exactly. And between 4:30 and 6:30.
That's what I tell all my reps. I'm like, hey, if you don't want to make 200 calls, that's fine. Make 100, but make them really good. And then your end result is double the amount of sets. Fantastic. Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. And that's like just thinking about it differently.
You got to be effective.
Exactly.
Versus you can make 200 calls very efficiently.
Everyone's like, I don't want to make 200 calls. It's like, well, I'm not telling you to make 200 calls to make 200 calls. I'm saying effectively make 200 calls. But if you can do it in 100, great.
Yeah. Just be effective is the idea. And efficiency, guess what? If you're making 200 calls efficiently and you don't do what you're supposed to for the company, if you produce less value than you're costing the company, you're efficiently fired.
Yeah, it's just like...
Okay.
It's just thinking about it differently. Yeah, we can go on and on about that.
Let's get into the habits. Yeah. Okay, so habit number 1 is be pro. And I'll say, the PC principle, I read this book years ago. The PC principle is one of probably 3 things in this book that still sticks with me. It's really, really important to understand, and it's super helpful. Super duper duper helpful. Okay, so habit number 1 is be proactive. Proactivity. And he gives an odd example of this. Not to say that he's not right. He's totally correct. But it wouldn't have been the example that I had guessed. So he talks about proactivity as in recognizing the difference between, and this will be familiar to you and to anybody that's listened to our show, the difference between stimulus and response, and how they're not tied to one another directly, that there's that space, there's that little tiny crack in between getting the stimulus and providing the response, and that's your room for proactivity. That's where it's on you to decide how you're going to react to that stimulus. And we all fall into this trap every day about this consequentialism, this, it's just excuse making. This was the stimulus, so this was my, why did you do that? Well, this was the stimulus, so then I responded this way, versus being proactive and thinking to yourself, okay, that was the stimulus. And it's so hard to do in the moment, but to say, okay, that was the stimulus. I kind of feel this response bubbling up inside of me. What can I do about that? What would be the ideal response? How can I counteract the response that I feel emotionally? And the example that he gives is really profound. It's Viktor Frankl, who wrote Man's Search for Meaning. He was a psychologist, a Jewish psychologist, placed in a concentration camp. And the book is about how him and his cohorts, his colleagues in this concentration camp, found meaning in that incredibly difficult situation. And so I'm just going to quote from the book. He takes some of this from Frankl, and some of this is just Stephen Covey's words. But it means that as human beings, we are responsible for our own lives. Our behavior is a function of our decisions, not our conditions. We can subordinate feelings to values. And we talk about values a lot on this show. And I think that just small idea, I may have another quote if we get to it right a page from now, but feelings versus values, and saying that feelings need to be secondary to values, I think is hugely missing in our society right now. I don't think, I mean, especially for those that are caught up in social media, which we talk about 3 times a week, or, or watching 24-hour news channels. It's all feeling, it's all emotion, and that's what they're designed to do. That's what CNN and Facebook and MSNBC and Instagram and Twitter, they're all designed to manipulate your feelings. And we never, as a society anymore, talk about values. And Covey says, in order to be proactive, in order to not just be a slave to whatever happens to you, it's and the example that he gives is as extreme as it gets, right? I'm thrown in a concentration camp. I'm taken from my family members who very well may not be alive anymore. I have no idea. I don't know whether I'm going to live or die. I'm subjected to this constant, ridicule, and I've got to do labor, and I'm malnourished, and just every possible conceivable thing. Your identity is stripped from you. You just go down the list, and those are the stimuli. Yet Frankl and the people around him still find meaning in that situation. Their value is that I am alive, and if I'm alive, I'm okay. And I still can derive value from my life because my life has value intrinsically. And it has nothing to do with how I feel about these horrible circumstances that I'm in right now. It has nothing to do with the stimuli that I'm experiencing. It has everything to do with what I value, and that, first and foremost, is that I'm alive today. And I can feel the sun on my face, and I may have protruding cheekbones because I weigh 110 pounds as a 6-foot-tall man, but at least I'm breathing oxygen. And that was his value. And it would be easy to subordinate values to feelings and say, well, screw it. Everybody around me is dying, and my family members very well may be dead, and this is no life worth living. I'll just give up. I'll just give up and die. And in that situation, if you give up, you die. It's not like you've got to go find a way to kill yourself. You're on the verge of death. And if you choose to die, you die. Hyperbole, but really true in a lot of cases where you're so weak, they're telling you to get up to go to work, and that's it. I'm done. It's easy to give up, but Frankl didn't, and he didn't because he chose his values over his emotions. And I'll just quote from the book one more time for this chapter. The ability to subordinate an impulse to a value is the essence of the proactive person. Reactive people are driven by feelings, circumstances, conditions, and their environment. Proactive people are driven by values, carefully thought about, selected, and internalized values.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think we did the book at Brendan Bouchard, who's a life coach and motivational speaker, world renowned, and his performance habits that he's done studies over, he said the number one is seeking clarity. And I think that goes back to that, is that he talks about how the first habit is seeking clarity, which is just about figuring out who you are, which is your values. You also have to define what's meaningful. So there is feeling.
habit one that he talks about, and I'll preface this by saying most of the good stuff is front-loaded in this book. There's one really good habit towards the back end, but I'm purposefully spending a lot of time towards the front end of the book because that's where I got the most value out of it. The second half of the Be Proactive chapter is the sphere of influence. Have you ever heard of the sphere of influence?
No.
Okay. So it's the same conversation as your locus of control. I believe you're familiar with locus of control. And for our listeners, if you have and just make it as simple as possible, if you have an internal locus of control, you believe that you mostly have control over your circumstances. And I can affect change in the world, whether it's on small scale or big scale, and to what degree you think you can affect change is your locus of control. If you have an external locus of control, it's like, well, my stimuli are responsible for the way that I respond to the stimuli. And people with an internal locus of control usually do far better in income and happiness and just about anything that you're going to measure than people with external locus of control, because you actually feel empowered to do something about it. That's the short version, but he explains this in a very interesting way by talking about spheres or circles of influence and circles or spheres of concern. And so you have your sphere of influence, and just picture there's a circle on the page and the whole circle is filled in, and that's your sphere of influence, and everything within that is something that I can influence. And if it's how long the grass is in my lawn, whether or not the garbage is taken out, and whether I'm out of shape, and whether I eat healthy, you could go on and on and on and on all day long about what's in your sphere of influence. Now, outside of your sphere of influence, imagine a circle that's slightly larger than that, but has the sphere of influence inside of it. That's your sphere of concern. Meaning there are things inside of your sphere of concern over which you don't really have any influence right now, yet. And the difference between those two is important to understand. And it's important to understand so that you can concentrate on increasing your sphere of influence. Is this, and this is, we talked about this with Epictetus, we talked about this with Ryan Holiday. Is this something that I can do something about? These circumstances make me unhappy. Can I affect change? And if not, just deal with it. And if you can, then you're compelled to do something about it. If you can, then you have a responsibility to influence that thing. If it's within your concern, if you're concerned about it and there's something that you can do about it, and doing something about it is for sure going to, have a positive impact, I compel you, I should say, to do something about it. Mm-hmm. So that's spheres of influence and concern, and we don't have enough time to really get into it, but that's probably in the top 5 things that I took out of this book is this within my sphere of influence? Is this it's obviously something I'm concerned about because I'm thinking about it. And if it's not within my sphere of influence, can I grow my sphere of influence or my circle of influence in order to be able to affect change in that? Mm-hmm. Make sense?
Yep.
Habit number 2. So that was habit number 1, be proactive. Habit number 2, begin with the end in mind. Mm-hmm. Talk about it every single week. So begin with the end in mind is pretty simple. I don't think it's too terribly difficult to understand. He's got an interesting way that he lays this out. So he talks about, kind of goal setting. I mean, this is just plain and simple. Begin with the end in mind. There's not a lot to it. It's not very cryptic. It's, before you start, know where you're going. And he talks about, talks about setting the goals, but then he also talks about the results of those goals and what's going to affect them. And he talks about it basically as like a center and then 4 arrows going out from the center, and the goal is the center, and the arrows going out from it are how that goal affects you, or what effect it's going to have on you, or how you're going to get there. There's a lot of different ways that he explains that you can think about it, but the 4 arrows going out from the goal. So the center is the goal. From there, that goal relates to security, guidance, wisdom, and power. And this is a little more abstract than the idea of like begin with the end in mind, but it's, is this goal going to provide me security? Am I going to, does it say anything about my identity if I accomplish this goal? What does this do for long-term success? Guidance is, do you know where to go? Do you have the knowledge necessary? Or is this going to increase your knowledge, right? You can think about this as like, how is this going to help me get to my goal? Or what is getting to this goal going to do for me in this regard? Mm-hmm. Make sense? Mm-hmm. So there's guidance, there's wisdom, which is just your outlook, it's your paradigms. So am I looking at this goal the right way in order to accomplish it? Or what will accomplishing this goal do for the way that I look at certain situations. And then the other thing is power, which is he defines the same way that Tony Robbins defines, which is the ability to take action. Do I have the ability to act on this? And if I accomplish this goal, will it help me act on other things? Let's begin with the end in mind. I won't beat that dead horse. Habit number 3, put first things first. Prioritize. This is effectiveness. This is not efficiency. This is what do you do when and why. And it's priorities, it's time management, it's delegation, it's saying no to things that aren't worth your time. He describes it in a really interesting way, which is with a matrix. He uses a matrix to describe this, and before he talks about, these are quadrants, right? So there's 4 quadrants in this matrix: quadrant 1, 2, 3, and 4. And quadrant 1 is something that's the matrix is 4 squares, right? It's just a square cut in 4, and on the left you have important and not important, and on the top you have urgent and not urgent. Right, so quadrant 1 is in the top left. That's things that are important and urgent. It's got to be done, and if it gets done, it gets a lot done. Right? On the bottom right is not important, not urgent. Not only does this not need to be done right now, also even if I do it, it's not really going to make any difference. Where the real work gets done are the things that are important. This is quadrant 2. So you have quadrant 1, urgent and important. Quadrant 2, still important, no longer urgent. You don't have a deadline that's hanging over your head, sort of Damocles waiting to drop on you at any moment. It's something that needs to be done. It's important, but there's nobody yelling at you to get it done. That's an important quadrant. And then quadrant 3 are things that are urgent, but they're not important. Also a very important quadrant to understand. Where somebody's yelling at you to get it done, where there's a timeline, where there's a sort of Damocles hanging over your head, it doesn't do anything. And it's efficient, but it's not effective.
Yep. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
So I love that idea that you have to be able to classify your activities into this. You have to be able to classify your goals and the things that you're trying to do. Is it urgent? Is it important? And figure out where it stands and take action accordingly. And if it's neither, don't do it. And if it's urgent but it's not important, maybe that's when you learn to say no.
Yeah, and I also think when I think about that habit, it's like always taking a step back and trying to figure out what is the thing you should be doing. Like sometimes you get lost as you go on your journey of doing a task and you get lost. So like I always think about sometimes, and I've learned this, I can't remember where, but it was like just what is the thing that matters the most? Focus on that. And I think that going back to like the most simple things that matter is what makes you people effective too. So
well, that's to me quadrant 2 that you're talking about is like what really matters, because if it's important and it's urgent, you know about it by definition. That's the urgency of it, is it's in front of your face saying, hey, get it done, get it done, get it done, get it done. It's me making sure you show up on time to record our podcasts. That's important and urgent because I'm putting it in front of your face. What's harder to see are the things that are really truly important, that really will make a difference, that really will increase your production capability, but there's nobody telling you to get it done right now. It's just sitting over there. Hey, whenever you can get to me, that'd be great. I'll just make your life better in every capacity. But it's just check your email. Let's send an email back
clouded,
to that. Yeah. Right. Go ahead. Do more of those urgent, not important things. Ignore the things that are important, but not urgent. Right. Like that's always kind of sitting there, waiting for you to make that mistake. I do want to read a little bit about time management here. He talks about the 4 generations of time management and kind of how time management started and where it went from there. So I'm just going to read this straight from the book. The first wave of generation could be characterized by notes and checklists in order an effort to give some semblance of recognition and inclusiveness to the many demands placed on our time and energy. Right, just write it down, and maybe you put it into some sort of priority. The second generation could be characterized by calendars and appointment books. This wave reflects an attempt to look ahead, to schedule events and activities in the future. The third generation reflects the current time management field. It adds to those preceding generations the important idea of prioritization, clarifying values, and comparing the relative worth of activities based on their relationship to those values. So we went from checklists to calendars, to kind of combining the two of them, and you do a checklist and you look at your calendar and you say, what's important? How do I prioritize these? How do I make sure that the important things are happening first? And then the fourth generation is different than both of those. It recognizes that, quote, time management is really a misnomer. The challenge is not to manage time, but to manage ourselves. Satisfaction is a function of expectation as well as realization. You'll be satisfied if you expect the right things and you realize those expectations. That's when you'll be satisfied. And expectation is in the sphere of influence.
Interesting.
Rather than focusing on things and time, fourth generation expectations focus on preserving and enhancing relationships and results. In short, maintaining the balance between production and production capability. So it's I guess his point is it's easy when prioritizing to forget about production capability. If you're just going to do time management and figure out what do I need to do when, you're probably going to do some urgent, not important things. Versus the fourth generation of time management, which says, let's maybe take a step back and figure out what's really going to affect major change here. So that's habit 3. Habit 4, think win-win. Not a whole lot to this. It's just, don't be a dick. Don't be an asshole. You know, don't try to go into a situation to get something instead of somebody else. Try to get into a situation and think, how can everybody benefit from this interaction? And this is the basics of sales, right? I don't expect you to lose on this transaction. I expect you to win on this transaction. And if I didn't expect you to win on this transaction, I wouldn't be able to sell this to you. If I thought you were going to buy this for $500 and it was going to make you $300, I know you're out $200. I'm never going to be able to convince you to buy it. If I genuinely think this costs you $500 and you're going to make $1,000, it's going to be the easiest sale I ever made, especially if it's true and I believe it. And that's the situation in which we need to approach our internal conversations with one another and our family relationships. The win-lose mindset always makes you lose. It's the Dale Carnegie. You can't win an argument. If you win an argument, you've lost because they hate you. Right? Like the only way to win an argument is they storm off and they're pissed, and then it's everybody's
gonna win.
So habit 4, think win-win. Okay? Think it. Habit 5, probably my favorite. We don't need to talk a whole lot about it, but it makes perfect sense to me. Seek first to understand, then be understood. Everybody always wants to be understood, Jeff. Everybody, that's all anybody wants, is to be understood. And nobody ever tries to understand first. I shouldn't say nobody. Plenty of people do. But on the whole, we don't seek first to understand. We seek first to be understood. And if you'll understand me, then maybe I'll give it a shot at understanding you. And that's the opposite of what it should be. Until I understand you, you'll never understand.
Yeah, because then there's a better working relationship between the two people and you actually get something done. So that makes, it just makes a lot of sense. It's very hard to do though.
Oh yeah. It's very, very difficult.
Everyone is,
Very important in sales. Insanely important in sales. If I just spew a bunch of words at you about how great my product is, and I don't know anything about you, I don't seek to understand you or your business at all, I'm just like every other guy calling. It could be calling from a call center in India and I don't know anything about your company and you're just a name on a list and I'm here making 300 calls a day trying to get somebody to take a meeting versus like making those 20 calls of people that I do understand. I did some research and I know your business and I can talk to you in a collegial manner about what your goals are and ask you some important questions about what you're trying to do as a business person. That's a much easier sell. So seek first to understand, then be understood. If you leave this podcast with one thing in your mind, seek first to understand, then be understood. Habit 6 is synergize. I'm not even going to talk about this at all. Just work together. This is, to be totally honest, I think he kind of liked the word synergize and then phoned it in when he wrote the chapter. It's, to be totally honest, it's the same thing as think win-win. Those two chapters are almost identical. Work together. Right? There's not too much to that. And then habit 7, seventh habit of highly effective people, sharpen the saw, renew yourself. And let me see if I can find this quote really quickly here. So sharpen the saw, very plain. Suppose you were to come upon someone in the woods working feverishly to saw down a tree. What are you doing, you ask? Can't you see? Comes the impatient reply. I'm sawing down this tree. Well, you look exhausted, you claim. How long have you been at it? Over 5 hours, he returns, and I'm beat. This is hard work. Well, why don't you take a break for a few minutes and you sharpen the saw? Don't you think it would get it done a whole lot faster? Well, I don't have time to sharpen the saw, the man says emphatically. I'm too busy sawing. Too busy sawing to sharpen the saw. Too busy producing to worry about how much you're capable of producing.
Yeah.
And it's, I'm sure this is misattributed. Abraham Lincoln, if you give me 4 hours to cut down a tree, I'm going to spend 3 hours sharpening the axe.
Yep.
And to me, that's the PC principle, is work harder on your ability to do effective work.
Yeah, the basic fundamental things.
Than you work harder. And this is Jim Rohn, one of my favorite, gurus. I'm sure he would hate that I just called him a guru. He's dead, so he doesn't care. Jim Rohn, work harder on yourself than you do on your job. Mm-hmm. And not in order to neglect your job, but because by being a better person, you'll be better at your job.
Yeah.
And that's the PC principle.
Okay, cool. Okay, well, that is it for the episodes of Books Are Great. If you're still listening at this point, you have probably enjoyed the show. If that's true, tell your friends to add Books Are Great into their podcast app and start listening. I need to mention that the views we have expressed in the show are ours and not those of the authors, editors, publishers we have discussed. I want to thank my co-host Joe Arco for bringing the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People to our attention, and extend our gratitude to Stephen R. Covey for writing such a great book. Listen again to hear about yet another on next week's episodes of Books Are Great. Thank you for listening. We'll talk to you soon.